Radwan and Nader, for those introductions. Like I said, this is a book that was published just this past Monday, and it is a book that is joint with Rached Ghannouchi. It consists of 10 previously untranslated essays by him on various aspects of the turn to the ideology of Muslim democracy, which the Ennahda Party famously declared at their annual party conference in 2016, having declared that they no longer identified with the idea of Islamism or political Islam and embraced the idea of Muslim democracy as opposed to previous ideologies that we might refer to as Islamic democracy or as the ideologies that were associated with the broader Islamist movement throughout the 20th and early parts of the 21st century. So the book consists of 10 essays by Ghannouchi that were previously inaccessible to an English-speaking audience, an introduction by me in which I give a kind of interpretive argument about how we should think about the ideology of Muslim democracy. And then most of the book is actually a lengthy philosophical dialogue between Ghannouchi and myself, covering all kinds of things from his childhood, his intellectual formation, his early years in the capital of Tunis, in Cairo, Damascus, France, the early years of the formation of the Islamist movement in the 1970s and 80s, and then all kinds of things about his ideological and doctrinal and philosophical trajectory. So the dialogue is something that I'm particularly excited about hearing the reaction to. I engage with him myself as a political philosopher, engaging with him not on the sorts of journalistic things that you might expect somebody to ask about, whether this or that tactical decision on the part of Ennahda since 2011, but on the deeper questions of what does it mean to think about Islamic law, pluralism, authority, legitimacy, the scope of popular sovereignty, the difference between theorizing democracy when you assume that the entire population or most of the population is morally committed to a form of Islam, as opposed to a theorization of democracy that begins with the fact of radical pluralism. Of course, the hallmark of Tunisian democracy, more so, I think, even than Egypt, the only comparable country that attempted a democratic transition, is the radical nature of political pluralism in Tunisia, whether that's because of certain kinds of Tunisian particularities or the long period of authoritarian secularizing rule that created different kinds of intellectual communities that were particularly hostile to Islamism and perhaps even forms of Islamic practice. And so Tunisia was a very, very unique situation in the Arab Muslim world, in which there were very, very strong, assertive, and electorally successful parties that were hostile to even a symbolic status for Islam in the public sphere. And so the turn to Muslim democracy, in my opinion, is fundamentally a reaction to this basic fact, of the fact of you theorize democracy or you practice democracy in conditions in which you can't assume a deep kind of moral, religious, epistemic, ideological consensus about the meaning of life, the status of Islam, the purpose of a political community, and you theorize democracy based on the recognition of quite radical pluralism. And in my interpretation, what's interesting about Muslim democracy is not just the fact of it, not just that you have an Islamist or a former Islamist party that is pragmatic, that deals with antagonistic parties, but that also makes an attempt to make sense of this from an intellectual, moral, and religious framework. And so, as is well known, Ghannouchi emphasizes certain things like the original covenant of Medina, the Sahifat al-Medina, in which the Prophet Muhammad created a kind of political community that did not assume deep moral consensus on the part of everybody subject to this authority, but recognized the existence of pluralism and a focus on shared objectives and shared values that were by and large worldly or secular. Now, whether or not this is a controversial interpretation of the Sahifat al-Medina, this became a central aspect of the religious framing and justification of the turn to Muslim democracy as opposed to what I refer to as Islamic democracy. There were other aspects of this, certain ways of arguing that the purpose of politics is to create the conditions for democracy. So an important aspect of any kind of democratic theory is drawing the boundaries between those that are party to democratic politics and those that are regarded as hostile or contrary to it. Throughout much of the history of Islamist theories of politics, the boundary was between those who accept Islam as an orienting truth about politics and those that are hostile to it. The turn to Muslim democracy involves saying that the fundamental divide is not between those who are pious Muslims and not pious Muslims, but those who accept democracy and those who are hostile to democracy. And so the way that I define the turn to Muslim democracy is, as I say in a article that I have forthcoming in the Journal of Political Theory, as post-sovereigntist, agonistic Islamic political thought. And what this means is that for most of the 20th century, Islamic political thought was oriented around the problem of sovereignty. So figures like Maududi and Qutb created the norm that Islamist intellectuals and activists define politics as being faithful to divine sovereignty. God is sovereign. God has decreed a law, and the purpose of politics is to recognize God's sovereignty and somehow bring about the law that God has revealed. Now, figures particularly like Rached Ghannouchi throughout the 1980s, 90s, and early 2000s theorized a very, very significant scope for popular sovereignty within an Islamic state. And so you have this turn throughout this period to recognizing that the people, even within an Islamic state, has sovereignty because there's nobody between God and the people, not rulers, not military commanders, and not even scholars. So the people has received the divine trusteeship or the divine caliphate and thus exercises divine sovereignty. The problem is that this still assumes the fact of a kind of sovereign people, a people that is morally unified around certain kinds of objectives, certain kinds of goals, and certain kinds of ways of seeing politics and truth. The turn to Muslim democracy abandons the language of sovereignty. It does not begin by saying God is sovereign, and it does not begin by saying a Muslim people is sovereign. It begins by saying the people that exist here now, whether they include leftists, communists, feminists, old regime, conservative figures, all are necessarily part of creating politics. So the idea of a sovereign entity is sort of abandoned, and the logic of politics is adopted. Politics is not just the application of theology or ethics or an ideal religious vision, but is a real world practice of pursuing tangible goals, a constitution, stability, economic prosperity, consensus, agreement, coalitions. And so it's a way of prioritizing politics and recognizing the political legitimacy of your opponents. They are not enemies. They may be antagonistic. They may have different agendas. They may be competitors, but their legitimacy as political opponents, as political agents, is recognized. And I think I'll conclude here. I think what I will say is we spent a lot of time, we being those in the West, worrying about whether Islam is compatible with democracy. Can Islamists be Democrats? Can Islamic parties be committed to democracy? Or is it just one person, one vote, one time? And I think the important thing, and here's the fundamental answer to the question that was set for this webinar: who is Rached Ghannouchi and why must he be released immediately? Above all, whatever disagreements you may have with his choice of coalition partners or particular political decisions during the 10 years of Tunisian democracy, what he represents as a decisive statement on the part of a very, very important Islamist intellectual and political actor, that all political actors and parties and agents and groups that are willing to participate in democracy are legitimate members of a political community. And when you reverse this, when you ask whether the same is true about many elements of the secular opposition in a country like Tunisia, did they recognize that Ennahda and other Islamist political actors were legitimate members of the political community, were legitimate members of democracy? The answer is very frequently no. Monica and others can attest to this much better than I can, but there was a sense that rejection of Ghannouchi and Ennahda went beyond criticism of political decisions, went beyond the idea that they may have political decisions or policy agendas that ought to be opposed, but to the very idea that they are not recognized as legitimate competitors or opponents in a political system, but as enemies who have no place in politics. And so we spent many, many years asking whether Islam is compatible with democracy or whether Islamist parties can be committed to democratic politics. And I think what circumstances like the Egyptian transition and the Tunisian transition force us to ask is whether or which Arab secular political parties and actors are compatible with democracy. Thank you.
Thank you, Andrew.